Nothing to My Name was the first song he ever heard that really seemed to be in a Chinese voice. And he wasn't alone. Coming home to Guizhou in the holidays, he found his old school friends were singing it too. They swaggered down the street at night, roaring drunk, singing it at the top of their lungs. It was how they felt, that they had nothing to their name, no direction and no way to express what they felt. And then this song had come along, and they realized they weren't alone. 3 years later, students would be singing it in Tiananmen Square. I don't think it was by chance that Cui Jiang came along when he did, Guo Jian told me one day. At that time, there was so much going on, new books, new ideas. The time was ripe. Cui Jiang was conjured up by people's needs. You wanted to express yourself. You wanted to make noise, and Cui Jiang brought us together to make noise. He was our Bob Dylan. I first heard Nothing to My Name sung in a cappella in Manker's tiny apartment one night in the early summer of 1986. Midway through a drunken dinner, a skinny guy with high cheekbones and weathered skin swayed to his feet and began to sing. At first I thought it was a folk song, as it had that kind of raw simplicity. But I soon knew this was no folk song. Around the low table people beat time, urging him on, and in the final verse they joined in. Oh, you will go with me. You will go with me. It was exhilarating. We applauded and then toasted the moment with beer and ergoto. I asked the nearest person to write down the lyrics for me in my notebook, and later I spent hours deciphering the characters until I had my own rough translation. I carried the piece of paper with me for years, even after the events of June 1989 leached the words of all their triumphant joy. Manker's apartment was up several flights of gray concrete steps in a characterless building in a remote part of town. Harshly lit and minimally furnished, it was also one of the most exciting places in Beijing. Ever since he had first started writing poetry, Manker had attracted people around him, but his work with Today had made him a legend. Beidao and Huang Rui had both left the country, but Manker remained. Aspiring artists, poets, dreamers, and random foreigners sought him out, and he received us generously, though not indulgently. Conversation was always vital around him. Suddenly I found myself having to have opinions again on T.S. Eliot or Albert Camus or Nietzsche or Freud, subjects I hadn't felt passionate about since I was a teenager. Encountering them again in Beijing in those days, their works hit me afresh. It seemed like every foreigner was treated as an emissary. I found myself thinking more deeply about my own culture than I had ever done before. Poetry came easily then, too. People got up to read their work as naturally as they would get up and sing. You would find yourself at poetry parties, the best of them held in the ruins of the old summer palace beyond the university district beneath the fragrant hills. A group of vagabond poets lived there, renting tumble-down rooms from farmers who cultivated crops among the fallen stones of what had been once a grand pleasure garden for the Qing emperors. You'd swig mouthfuls of burning strong ergoto and lie on your back and look at the stars, the words reeling in your head. On warm nights, you would sleep outside and in the morning cycle back into town in a dream. In those days, I'd often find lines of Western poetry humming in my head, as powerful as if they had been written for that moment. On a seemingly endless loop came the famous couplet from Wordsworth, The French Revolution as it appeared to enthusiasts at its commencement. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. To be young was very heaven. It was bliss, and I missed entirely the warning in the title. Leaving Manker's place or the old summer palace was always disorienting. On the surface, the city seemed not to be changing at all. The stately bicycles still dominated the roads. Clerks still napped, heads on their arms, on the counters of the state-owned stores. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs still held their surreally uninformative press conferences weekly, without fail, and most of the city was shuttered and dark by 6 p.m. That was when the other Beijing came to life. In those years, I often felt that my existence was a black-and-white movie that only flared into color after dark. Much of my journalistic round focused on the stream of businessmen, legitimate and carpetbaggers alike, who were flocking to China in search of a fortune, or on the revolving door of world leaders coming to pay court. Every few days, a new national flag would be hoisted alongside China's on Chang'an Avenue, and China Daily would feature yet another headline hailing China's ties with yet another nation. One day it would be the Pakistan relationship that was going from strength to strength. Then a few days later, it would be New Zealand's turn or Zimbabwe's. Queen Elizabeth II came calling too. She arrived by plane, but the royal yacht met her in Shanghai, where she threw a lavish shipboard banquet, much to the chagrin of the trade officials of less favored countries. Hard to compete with the yacht, they muttered. Covering these visits could be fun, notably the Queen's arrival, which found me throwing back a supercharged gin and tonic at 11 a.m. at a special drinks party for the Commonwealth Press Corps. But there was a sense that most of the business stories in those days were going nowhere. It would be some time before foreign companies and governments discovered how best to work the angles to profit from China's opening. But all of that was just a sideshow besides the momentousness of China's transformation. We were witnessing a movement of people and an economic upheaval to rival the Industrial Revolution. It was irresistible to look to history for clues as to what this might mean. Releasing farmers from the communes, promoting private enterprise and encouraging a free flow of workers to the cities and to the new special economic zones seemed to guarantee a rise in China's people's autonomy and a loosening of the control of the Communist Party. We looked to countries like Britain, where industrialization had led to the rise of the middle class, the establishment of trade unions, a free media, non-government organizations, and other hallmarks of a civil society, and ultimately to parliamentary democracy. Surely China would go the same way. The opening up of China's economy and society became visible to us in small ways every day. A new freewheeling class of independent small traders, known as the Getihu, appeared across the city, repairing shoes and bicycles, tailoring colorful clothes made to measure, roasting sweet potatoes and chestnuts on upturned oil drums, and hawking candied apples, pinwheels, and brilliantly colored kites. Free markets popped up near the diplomatic compounds and out near the Beijing Zoo, selling clothes that had mysteriously slipped out of the export stream and onto makeshift stalls on dusty patches of parkland, many of which sheltered a brisk black market in foreign exchange as well. Farmers would suddenly appear by the road selling types of fruits and vegetables that hadn't been seen in the city in decades. I can still remember the excitement when a pedal cart laden with strawberries was sighted, trundling into town along the Third Ring Road. In the following days, I ate strawberries everywhere. Today they are a regular part of spring in the capital, but then they seemed like they came from another world. We believed in the flow of Western ideas, and liberalization was unstoppable. The anti-spiritual pollution campaign was officially condemned as a mistake, a piece of overreach by the old guard that had foundered once it was seen to threaten economic reforms and relations with the West. There was a freer tone in the media, too, not just in cultural magazines, but in bold experiments such as the World Economic Herald in Shanghai, which pushed for deeper reforms. Adding to our optimism was that, as far as we could tell, Deng Xiaoping's leadership team was pragmatic and outward-looking, too. Both the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Hu Yaoban, and Premier Zhao Ziyang wore their commitment to the open-door policy on their sleeves of their Western suits. It was pretty clear that Hu Yaoban had run dead on the anti-spiritual pollution campaign, and that he welcomed, rather than feared, foreign influences. Zhao Ziyang had been an early pioneer of the reforms that had liberated China's farmers from the communes, and he was known to favor giving more power to managers throughout the economy to run their enterprises without party interference. We believed we were witnessing the gradual retreat of the party from Chinese people's lives, both in policy and in the personal style of the leaders. Hu Yaoban was seen openly reading a newspaper at dull political events, while Zhao Ziyang was fond of golf. Zhao's daughter worked as an events manager at a Western hotel. But in all our calculations, we were too complacent. We could see how profoundly Deng Xiaoping's reforms were exposing the hollowness of the Communist project in China, laying bare how little it had achieved and how much had been destroyed in the process. But we failed to see how destabilizing that would be. We could join in the jokes about the party's official verdict on Mao Zedong, that he had been 7 parts good and 3 parts bad, laughing when our Chinese friends would say that surely the formula was the wrong way round. But we didn't consider how wrenching such a verdict would be for the people who had grown up being taught to venerate Mao and honor the party. We didn't see how the disillusionment would hit the country's youth as they were told to put aside one set of ideals and be given nothing to replace them but slogans like, "To get rich is glorious." I failed to hear the desperation in "nothing to my name." They had stripped naked on a freezing day and bound themselves in surgical bandages, then draped themselves in white and black cloth. Dressed in the traditional colors of mourning, they drenched each other in red paint, which dripped from their bodies like blood. In white, black, and red, the colors of death and violence, they walked through the campus like mourners out of hell. As they walked, they screamed out the names of icons of China's culture, the Great Wall and the Yangtze River, yelling the names as if those of the dead. The performance happened in December 1986 at an art festival organized by Peking University. When 4 young students from off-campus had offered to create an artwork, the authorities saw no reason to turn them down. But when they saw the result, they were appalled. What did it mean? Among the 4 students was Sheng Qi. He had arrived in Beijing in the late summer of 1984, hyped up with excitement, but he had become quickly disillusioned with art school. He had expected his teachers to be how he'd imagined artists would be, with strong, creative, open-minded personalities, but they were just like his parents. They had the same haircuts and the same clothes. He had expected them to be exceptional, but they were no different to every other adult he'd met. Many, in fact, were members of the Communist Party. Realism was all the rage at his school then, or at least the approved version of realism. The teachers would take their students to the seaside or to some picturesque village in the countryside to capture real life. Real life, Sheng Qi scoffed to one of his friends. Why do we have to do that? We grew up in the city. We have our own problems, our own life. Why do we have to go to a village for inspiration? Inspiration is inside us. It's in our daily life. We don't have to go to some exotic place to find it. He started to ask himself what art really was, burying himself in books and tracing the movements that had driven Western art, seeking out the poets who had inspired him, like Manker and Beidao, and meeting young artists like my friend from the Friendship Hotel party who had already dropped out of the system. All through our schooling, we had been fed this revolutionary, romantic, heroic story, and all of us wanted to be heroes. We wanted to make history and be loyal to our country. We were told that our country equaled our government, that it equaled the state, and we should be loyal to that. We had been brainwashed for more than 20 years. Yet deep inside, we still wanted to be heroes. We still wanted to make history. It was clear to him that the system had to be broken, but he had no idea how. At that time, we didn't even have the basic knowledge or information about what society truly was. We had no point of comparison. We didn't really know about Western culture. All we knew was communist China. As students, we were so powerless. We were so weak that we had to shout. Ordinary art would be meaningless, so we decided to make this kind of demonstration. Years later, I asked him what they were mourning for that day. We were mourning for our culture, for traditional culture, for traditional morals, for the traditional philosophy of China. The students felt they had lost so much which they had never had the chance to know. We chose the strongest colors, we shouted, we were extreme, all because we were the opposite. We were powerless and hopeless. That day they embodied a right to be seen that was extreme, and those who witnessed their performance were shocked. But in their basic motivation, they were not alone. Around the country in December 1986, thousands of students were also mobilizing to be heard. The demonstrations began in Sheng Qi's hometown of Hefei. Since 1980, students have been trying to exercise the limited democratic rights promised under China's constitution. That document established a 4-tier system of people's congresses designed to represent Chinese citizens from the village to the national level. Delegates to the congresses at the county, provincial, and national level were elected by the representatives of the tier below them, with representatives at the bottom tier elected directly by the people at the village level. In theory, anyone could stand for election to these village congresses, yet despite students around the country waging successful campaigns for election in 1980, 1982, and 1984, the party had stepped in each time to impose their own candidates. In 1986, the students in Hefei had had enough. On December 5th, and then again a few days later, around 3,000 students rallied in the city under banners that recalled the words of Wei Jingshen. No democratization, no modernization. A few days later, 5,000 students were marching in the industrial city of Wuhan in the neighboring province of Hubei. Reports filtered in of protests in remote places like the far southern city of Kunming and the special economic zone of Shenzhen. 2 weeks later, on December 20th, some 30,000 students marched down the Bund in Shanghai, behind banners declaring, "Give us democracy" and "Long live freedom," while at least another 30,000 Shanghai residents rallied in support. By then, the list of grievances had extended to issues such as corruption and broader calls for democracy and freedom of speech. On the night of December 23rd, just hours after Shengqi and his 3 friends brought their own kind of demonstration to Peking University, protests broke out in the neighboring University of Tsinghua, with thousands rallying in the university quarter. Over the coming days, students from other campuses, including Peking University, joined in. Peking University had a tradition of being in the vanguard of social movements. It was there in the early decades of the 20th century that the New Culture movement was launched, seeking to free China from the feudal influences of Confucianism in favor of a new culture based on democracy and science. It was the students from Peking University who rallied in 1919 against the Treaty of Versailles, which handed German territorial holdings in China to the Japanese. This was a trigger for the so-called May 4th movement, the leaders of which would go on to found the Chinese Communist Party. Less honorably, but more recently, Peking University had been a center of action during the early days of the Cultural Revolution. In the days leading up to New Year's Eve, posters went up at Peking University proposing that the students should rally in Tiananmen Square, a dramatic escalation. The posters argued that taking their protests to the heart of the capital would signal their intention to lead the promotion of democracy in China, as the government had failed to do so. Everyone knew that a successful demonstration at the square would elevate the students' movement to a different level. It was at Tiananmen Square in 1919 that the May 4th movement was born. It was there that the Red Guards had come to receive the blessings of Mao Zedong in the summer of 1966. And it was there that ordinary Beijingers had demonstrated in the morning of Zhou Enlai at Qingming in 1976. New Year's Day 1987 was one of the coldest days of a bitterly cold winter. Dozens of police staked out Tiananmen Square, and early that morning, a water truck sprayed the flagstones to create a treacherous sheet of ice. The students arrived in small groups and formed into lines near the square. They waited until they were several hundred strong, then rushed the police lines. But once on the square, they couldn't maneuver on the ice, and within minutes, dozens had been thrown into police vans. That afternoon, it seemed the students had been defeated. It was impossible to discover how many were under arrest and what they might be charged with. There was talk of a few students being taken away for education and interrogation. Back at Peking University, thousands began to gather. Outraged at the arrests, students who had been reluctant to join the earlier demonstration determined that they should march again on the square to demand their classmates' release. At midnight, they set out on the long march from the university district in the west to the center of the city, their numbers swollen to around 5,000. On the way, the news came through that their classmates had been released without charge, and the students returned triumphantly to their campus. In the immediate days following, the government no doubt thought they had pulled off a good result. They had given the students in Beijing a win, but not a substantive one. And with the end-of-term examinations and Chinese New Year approaching, students across China would have little appetite for more marching. The government hadn't needed to engage directly with any of the issues, and they had brought themselves time to regroup. But the students had made dissent visible again for the first time since Democracy Wall, and the uncomfortable message for the leadership was that China's educated youth were significantly out of sympathy with the Communist Party's directions and ideals. In Shanghai, they had seen how easily the students could make allies of ordinary citizens and workers who may have felt less passionate about democracy but were concerned about the downsides of the reforms: inflation, income inequality, and corruption. Writing about the demonstrations in a piece for Australia's Times on Sunday, I found myself uneasy. I noted how the students seemed to have fallen in love with their own image in the glare of Western media attention. I could see how readily they picked up on the references and descriptions that the Western press used. The students saw themselves exercising people power and standing for civil rights, and they could imagine how their struggle linked them with the Western student movements of 1968. I worried about how this might influence them in the future. Nevertheless, when I filed the piece, I felt relieved that the demonstrations had ended well. But within less than a fortnight, it was clear they had not ended well at all. News filtered through of troublemakers being arrested around the country, among them a young poet I had partied with at the Old Summer Palace just months before. He was no counter-revolutionary, just a romantic spirit with a penchant for Nietzsche, who had been caught up in the excitement. Meanwhile, high-profile and popular liberals, such as the vice president of Hefei's University of Science and Technology, Feng Lizhi, and crusading journalist Liu Bingyang, were sacked from their jobs and expelled from the Communist Party. It seemed that the authorities wanted to send a message to the students without risking attacking them directly. Then on January 16th, amid a rising tide of denunciations of the evils of bourgeois liberalization, it was announced that Hu Yaoban had resigned and had been forced to make a humiliating self-criticism. We did not know it then, but Hu Yaoban had been vulnerable for a long time. As General Secretary of the Communist Party, he was responsible for upholding the party's principles, but, unlike the conservatives within the party and indeed Deng Xiaoping himself, who did not consider liberalization and the influence of Western ideas as a threat, he repeatedly ran dead when asked to crack down on liberals within party ranks, and had shown little zeal for the campaign against spiritual pollution. Now the whole blame for the student demonstrations was laid at his feet. Scapegoating Hu Yaoban may have been satisfying to his conservative rivals, but to blame the demonstrations on ideological laxity was to fatally miss the point. The government and the party itself were facing a crisis of legitimacy. Economic reforms promised greater prosperity and greater autonomy, yet for many students and city dwellers, such promises seemed remote. They were longing for greater control over their lives and for avenues to make their needs heard, and instead were left frustrated and thwarted. As winter turned to spring, we hunkered down to wait out the campaign against bourgeois liberalization. We were confident it wouldn't last long. The reform and opening up of China's economy required an engagement with the West and a retreat from ideology, and we knew that Zhao Ziyang, now installed as head of the party in Hu Yaoban's place, was committed to reform. My Chinese friends felt they'd seen it all before. They had lived through the crackdown after Democracy Wall and the anti-spiritual pollution campaign too. They would just have to fade back again into an underground where they could continue to be free. We Westerners assumed it would be a temporary reversal. We believed we knew the way history was heading, and that time was on the reformer side. Friends in the diplomatic corps advised me that it would be a good idea to lie low for a while, and perhaps cut contact with my friends in the underground. But I knew that without them, I would lose touch with what was really going on in the city. Through them, too, I knew I could get closest to the emotional landscape of the time. And anyway, they were my friends. As a concession, I decided to be more discreet. In a city where public transport stopped early and taxis didn't cruise the streets, I got into a habit of sleeping over at my friends' places at the end of evenings together, leaving in the morning once the workday had begun. In early 1971, I was no longer staying at the relatively free-wheeling Friendship Hotel, but instead in the diplomatic compound at the western end of Chang'an Avenue. I knew that the guards on the gate and the lift operators kept careful note of our comings and goings. If I made a habit of not coming home at night, they might start to take more of an interest in where I was spending my time. Getting home at the end of an evening was easier said than done, with most of my friends living a long hike away from Chang'an Avenue, where you could usually find a taxi at one of the hotels. One night, as I made my way home with a friend through the empty streets, we saw an army truck lumbering towards us down the road. A little tipsy, we decided to wave it down. To our amazement, it stopped. "Where are you going?" the driver yelled down over the sound of the engine. We told him. "Hop in," he said cheerfully. "I'll give you a lift." We scrambled up into the cab of the truck and set off. On our way, he told us he was from the country and was now based in the west of Beijing, out near Fragrant Hills. Being in the army was okay, he said, though he liked driving best. At the compound, he brushed off our thanks. "Serve the people," he replied with a smile, quoting the old Maoist slogan, and we all laughed. Later, my friends told me that since the Korean War, soldiers were widely referred to as China's 最可爱的人, the most beloved people. Our driver's cheery generosity was a typical example of why. Later, I would wonder what happened to that young soldier and where he had been in 1989 when the army rolled into Beijing. In the spring of 1987, getting a ride home in an army truck just seemed like one of those things that could happen only in China, part of the endearing anarchy of the place. Now, like so much about the 1980s, it seems almost unimaginable. Chapter 5. a terrible beauty. At noon on May 15, 1989, the Soviet President, Mikhail Gorbachev, landed at Beijing Airport. It was the first visit by a Russian leader to China in 30 years. Gorbachev had come to the Chinese capital for a historic summit to bury the long-standing rift between the two communist giants. In the early years of the People's Republic, Soviet money and expertise had poured into the country, transforming China's industry, infrastructure, arts, architecture, and education. But within a decade, the relationship had soured. China chafed at its role as little brother to the USSR, was disillusioned when Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union from 1955 to 1964, failed to support China in its disputes with Indonesia and India, and rejected the Soviet notion of peaceful coexistence with the West. In 1960, the Soviet Union withdrew all its experts from China, abandoning hundreds of projects and taking with them the nuclear expertise they had promised to share. Now in the spring of 1989, Gorbachev had arrived to pay court to China and its paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping. It was a huge story, and media from around the world had flown to cover it. Both communist leaders fascinated the West, each with their separate programs to reform and open up their massive countries. Deng and Gorbachev had become poster boys for progress, each separately crowned as Time magazine's Man of the Year. Their summit was supposed to be a great moment in history, but history was to upstage it. Reporters flying into Beijing found a city not in the grip of preparations for an historic summit, but enthralled to quite a different drama. As Gorbachev touched down, instead of columns of soldiers and photogenic children arrayed to meet him in the heart of the city, there were some 2,000 students on a hunger strike and 500,000 Beijingers lending them support. Gorbachev was welcomed in a hurried ceremony on the tarmac at Beijing Airport and forced to enter the Great Hall of the People on Tiananmen Square by a back entrance when he arrived to meet Deng Xiaoping. That week, the media feeds from Beijing were full of students' demonstrations, and the summit was reduced to a footnote. As a visiting CNN reporter put it in his broadcast, "We came here to report a summit, and we walked into a revolution." In the square, the students made posters in Russian greeting the Soviet leader and petitioned the Soviet embassy for a chance to meet with the great man. Guo Jian, who had joined the hunger strike, read with excitement an article on the prophecies of Nostradamus that was circulating among the students. It claimed the Soviet leader's rise had been foretold and that it presaged massive change in both China and the USSR. Guo Jian wasn't superstitious, but in those superheated days of May, he began to wonder whether maybe it was all meant to be. Irrespective of prophecy, he was ready to stand up. All my life I had lived in fear, and I thought by joining the demonstrations, by joining the hunger strike, that it was my chance to throw off fear. This was what we were fighting for. I just didn't want to live in fear anymore. Meanwhile, Deng Xiaoping gathered the Chinese leadership at his home on the morning of May 17th. The demonstrations had been going on for a month, and China now had been humiliated in the eyes of the world. The morning after shaking Gorbachev's hand and formally ending the Sino-Soviet split, Deng Xiaoping made the decision to impose martial law. The hinge year of Chinese contemporary history is 1989. Looking back, you can see how events from the beginning of reform and opening up in 1978 rushed toward the denouement of June 1989, and how everything since can be seen in relation to that moment, either as a reckoning with, a reaction to, or a retreat from the time before. Today, people in China refer to before 1989 or after 1989 as routinely as an earlier generation in the West might have referred to before and after World War I. There is the same acceptance that June 4th, 1989 marked an end, after which nothing would ever be the same again. The events of 1989, like World War I, were long in the making. They were coming from the moment Democracy Wall was closed down and Wei Jingsheng was imprisoned 10 years earlier. Those actions had simply deferred the showdown between the government and the governed about what kind of nation China was meant to be. The students and citizens who rallied in Tiananmen Square in 1989 may have only had a hazy idea of what democracy might mean, but they knew what they wanted: greater respect from their government and a greater say in the running of their country. They wanted a dialogue, to no longer be treated as supplicants, but as equals. The demonstrations were sparked by the death of Hu Yabang in April that year. as with the death of Zhou Enlai in 1976, whose passing would serve both as a catalyst and a cover. Tension had been winding tighter for more than a year. When Hu Yaban died, it was like the crack from a starter's gun, signaling that an event long anticipated could at last begin. In the summer of 1988, the national network China Central Television, CCTV, broadcast a series called River Elegy. Originally conceived as a conventional celebration of the Yellow River as the cradle of Chinese civilization, the project was entrusted to an iconoclastic young director who transformed it into a blistering critique of the backwardness of Chinese culture and a call to arms. In River Elegy, the Yellow River was presented not as a symbol of China's ancient civilization, but instead as a metaphor for its decline. The river was silted up and sluggish. The culture it represented sclerotic, moribund, insular, and feudal, doomed unless it embraced modernity and openness as represented by the West. China could not produce another great civilization, the series argued, if it relied on its old ways. It needed to pursue industrialization, free trade, greater economic reform, and, it hinted, political reform if it was to be reborn. The iconoclasm did not stop with the Yellow River. The Great Wall, according to River Elegy, did not embody strength, but insularity and fear. The dragon, the greatest of Chinese symbols, was not noble and powerful, but tyrannical and cruel. River Elegy was like a hand grenade thrown into the debate about China's identity. 200 million people watched it across the country, and the Communist Party's official paper, the People's Daily, published the scripts in full. Scores of literary salons have been popping up in universities across the country to foster discussion about the future direction of China, and now River Elegy became a key text in stimulating debate and engendering a sense of urgency and crisis. The series argued that in the absence of a middle class, it was from China's intellectuals that the momentum for change should come. Students throughout the country believed that it was up to them to respond. Conservatives in the leadership were appalled. It was clear that the series supported the reformers in the government. Footage of Zhao Ziyang appeared when the series struck a positive or dynamic note, while Mao Zedong was seen when the mood was dark. When CCTV wanted to rebroadcast the series later that year, major cuts were made, but it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. 1988 was a fevered year of surging inflation and increasingly visible corruption. Price reform had been botched, setting off panic buying and hoarding. People well placed in the system exploited the difference between state and market prices, making fortunes in the process, while workers' wages were being eaten by inflation. Across the country there were scattered strikes. Meanwhile, students discovered that a place at university no longer guaranteed you a job. The old system of job assignments on graduation may have been stultifying, but at least it had provided some sense of security. While people with connections scored lucrative jobs in the special economic zones, those without struggled to find decent jobs at all. A popular saying captured their predicament: as poor as a professor, as dumb as a PhD. Everywhere there was a sense of agitation and stress. A frustrated population of Chinese youths looking for a place in the world were more than ready to answer a call to arms. That 1989 should be a landmark year in China was almost overdetermined. It marked 200 years since the French Revolution, 70 since the launch of the May 4th movement, 40 years since the founding of the People's Republic, and 10 years since Deng Xiaoping's triumphant trip to the United States, which had heralded China's opening to the West. It would prove to be China's year of living dangerously, as the party and the people competed to seize the symbolism of the times. In January, Feng Lizhi, the liberal scientist who had been sacked from his job and expelled from the party for his role in the 1986 student demonstrations, wrote an open letter to Deng Xiaoping. He proposed that in honor of the anniversaries of the May 4th movement and the founding of the People's Republic, and in the spirit of the ideas of the French Revolution, an amnesty should be declared for political prisoners in China, and in particular, that Wei Jingsheng should be finally released. Wei had been in prison for 10 years, but he had not been forgotten. During the student demonstrations in 1986, posters had appeared declaring rhetorically, "If you want to know what freedom is, just go ask Wei Jingsheng." He was no longer just a man, but a symbol. A few weeks after Feng Lizhi published his open letter, Beidao rallied 32 writers, academics, and artists to sign a petition in support. Addressed to the leadership of the National People's Congress and the Communist Party, it called for a general pardon of political prisoners and, specifically, the release of Wei Jingshan. The response from China's leaders was silence, while spokespeople down the food chain batted the issue aside. As China had no political prisoners, they said, there could be no question of amnesty. Meanwhile, passionate discussion about China's future bubbled up in the university salons. There were debates about deeper economic reform and democratic participation, about freedom of speech, and about corruption and nepotism. There were debates about the very nature of Chinese culture. At Peking University, the salons were often attended by Feng Lizhi, who expounded his idea that democracy was not something that could be handed down from above, but instead must be fought for from below. Among those who listened were students who went on to be the leaders of the movement at Tiananmen Square. Around the country, scores of unofficial art groups had sprung up too, from the tough Manchurian city of Harbin in the north to the subtropical special economic zone of Xiamen in the south. The young artists ganged together, encouraging each other to push the limits of their art. Much of the work was surreal or unnerving, or sometimes simply absurd. The year 1989 was an anniversary for them too. It was 10 years since the stars had hung their work outside the National Art Museum in Beijing. Now, artists from around the country had been invited to exhibit inside the museum in a major show boldly called China Avant-Garde. The young curators had chosen more than 100 artists and 250 works to introduce Chinese contemporary art to the nation and the world. The logo for the exhibition was a sign indicating no U-turn, signaling boldly in red, white, and black that there would be no turning back now for China's avant-garde. On the morning of the opening on February the 5th, giant exhibition banners were laid out on the steps of the museum, the No U-Turn logo standing out starkly on a dead black background. February is Beijing's cruelest month. In the dry cold, the skin splits on your fingers and static electricity crackles in the air. And yet, despite the grim weather, a large, excited crowd arrived in time for the opening at 9 a.m. The main exhibition hall was dominated by a massive triple portrait of Mao, the standard image rendered in the tones of newsprint and overlaid with a grid, as if someone had produced an image of the chairman from an instruction sheet. It reduced the great leader from an icon to something that could be painted by numbers, a commodity. Around the portrait there was a sense of chaos, as many of the works seemed to mock the very idea of an exhibition and the whole project of reform and opening up. In one corner, an artist sat on a bed of straw surrounded by eggs and a banner with the word, "Waiting." Around his neck, he wore a sign that read, "To avoid disturbing future generations, no debates during the hatching." Another artist set up a stall to sell shrimp and called the work Big Business. Soon hustled away by police for illegal trading, he returned later to put up a sign that read, "Closed for stock taking." Yet, another threw condoms and coins into the air, which fell like confetti on some of the artworks on display. The owner of one of them complained that the condoms were rendering his piece unrecognizable. A little ironic, given his work was a pile of paper pulp, claimed to be the result of putting the history of Chinese painting and the history of modern Western art through a washing machine. The lists of artists involved read like a who's who of today's upper echelons of Chinese contemporary art, their works in 1989 just hinting at the qualities that would one day make them famous. Among them was Zhang Shaogang, who would become China's most famous artist, and who we will meet later in this story. All of these artists, however, even Wang Guangyi, whose portrait of Mao initially dominated the exhibition, were destined to be upstaged by a young artist called Xiao Lu. Her work was titled Dialogue. Installed in a prime position on the ground floor of the museum, it comprised 2 phone booths, each with a mannequin inside. One was a man, the other a woman, both with their backs turned, both on the phone. Between the two was a table backed by a mirror, with a red rotary dial phone, the receiver off the hook. 2 hours into the show, Xiao Lu approached the installation, produced a pistol, and fired 2 shots at it, cracking the mirror and plunging the hall into panic. She later claimed that her act was not meant to be political, that she was simply expressing the impossibility of dialogue between men and women. But in China in 1989, Dialogue was a loaded word. A call for dialogue between the government and the people had been a key theme of River Elegy, and it was an idea that was also being promoted by Zhao Ziyang. That Xiaolu's portrayal of a failed dialogue ended in gunfire gave her performance that day the status of a play within a play. The story of the Tiananmen movement acted out in a gallery before it had even occurred. Marx wrote that history repeats itself, first as a tragedy, then as a farce. Here, maxim was reversed. In that year of 1989, the story of dialogue was repeated, first as farce, then as tragedy. As for the exhibition itself, after Xiaolu's intervention it was closed down. The curators gained permission to reopen a few days later, only to be closed down again for good after bomb threats. It hardly mattered. The exhibition had already had its place in history, another way station along the road to the events of June. On April 15, 1989, Hu Yaoban died and the curtain rose. The students knew their history. They knew that mourning for Zhao Enlai had triggered the 1976 Qingming demonstrations, which were harbingers of the fall of the Gang of Four and the rise of Deng Xiaoping and the Reform era. In their mourning for Hu Yaoban, they saw their opportunity to make history. Within hours of the news of Hu's death, posters were going up at Beijing's universities, mourning his passing, but also demanding a reversal of the criticism that had accompanied his fall from power. By the morning of April 17th, students across 26 of the capital's universities had held spontaneous memorials, and the mourning posters had been joined by others launching scathing attacks on the current state of Chinese society. Wreaths and elegiac poems had already appeared around the monument to the people's heroes on Tiananmen Square. After midnight on the night of April 17th, a column of around 1,000 students set out to march the 18 kilometers from Peking University to Tiananmen Square. Passing through the university district, they gathered another 2,000 students marching behind a banner proclaiming Hu Yaoban, the soul of China. Arriving at Tiananmen Square before dawn, they hung their banner from the monument to the people's heroes and together sang the International. Arise, ye prisoners of starvation, arise, ye wretched of the earth. If Nothing to My Name would be the anthem to the student movement, the International would be its hymn. It was a song everyone knew, students, workers, ordinary Beijingers. By singing it, they linked themselves to revolutionary movements around the world and to the noble history of struggle that had given birth to modern China. They would sing it often over the next fevered weeks, even as they were surrounded by soldiers and tanks on their last night in Tiananmen Square. From this distance, you can see how the whole tragedy played out, from the moment of elation before dawn on April 18th to the desperate denouement in the dark hours before dawn on June 4th. You can see the bad decisions, the bad luck, the forks in the road where a different choice would have changed the outcome. By the end, less than 2 months later, some students were speaking openly of dying for their cause. But on that spring morning in April, they felt only excitement and self-confidence. The students announced their demands, which they drew up into a formal petition. They asked for the affirmation of Hu Yaoban's views on democracy and freedom, for the repudiation of the campaigns against spiritual pollution and bourgeois liberalization, and the rehabilitation of those who had suffered under them, for the public declaration of assets of government leaders and their families, for freedom of speech and the press, and increased funding for education. The students then began a sit-in in front of the Great Hall of the People, the seat of China's parliament, the National People's Congress, to wait for a response. Tensions grew as the students waited. Some junior officials were sent to receive the petition, but the students wanted to hand it to someone in authority. That night they dramatically upped the ante by moving their demonstration to the real seat of power, the leadership compound of Zhongnanhai, just west of the Forbidden City. On the night of April 18th, and then again on the night of April 19th, some 2,000 students stood at the gates of Zhongnanhai and, surrounded by spectators, called for Premier Li Peng to come out and meet them. There were chaotic scenes as some surged toward the gates and were only held back with difficulty by lines of police. Inside Zhongnanhai, a split was already opening up in the leadership. In the face of concerns from the old guard, Zhao Ziyang argued that the students' stance should be considered patriotic, despite the actions of a rowdy minority, and that their right to memorialize Hu Yaoban should be respected. His premier, Li Peng, urged a hard line. At the base, the split reflected a dramatic difference of outlook between the two men. Zhao Ziyang was interested in the potential for dialogue between the regime and the people as a way of advancing reform in the rule of law. Li Peng was aligned with the old guard, who were keen to put a brake on reform, re-establish old-style central planning, and put an end to the bourgeois liberalism. Li's approach was traditional and autocratic. The Communist Party equaled the people. What need was there to negotiate with themselves? Back at the universities, the situation was evolving fast. The students were already setting up an independent organization to lead their movement, turning their back on the official student bodies sanctioned by the party. The leaders of these new unions would become the face of the student movement in the following weeks. Earnest, intelligent, passionate advocates whose prominence would earn them a place on the most wanted list after June 4th. The official memorial service for Hu Yaoban was set for April 22nd at the Great Hall of the People. The students began gathering on Tiananmen Square before dawn, their numbers swelling to the tens of thousands as the service began. Inside the hall, 4,000 official mourners, including Deng Xiaoping, listened as Zhao Ziyang delivered the eulogy, which was broadcast to the silent crowd outside. At the end of the ceremony, 3 students climbed the stairs to the entrance of the hall and knelt, the central figure holding aloft their petition, entreating Premier Li Peng to come out to meet them. It was a shocking gesture. Petitioning on bended knee was an echo of China's imperial past and a dramatization of the true balance of power in this nominal People's Republic. The students knelt on the steps for half an hour, but no one came. It would prove to be the first in a string of mistakes, when chances for dialogue and reconciliation were squandered. Many watching on were enraged that Li Peng would let the students humiliate themselves in this way and not respond. Many in the square wept. The students' kneeling figures, seeming so tiny on the grand steps, became a symbol of the indifference of the government and swelled the ranks of popular support for the students' cause. The very next day, an even graver mistake was made. Zhao Ziyang left the country for a week-long state visit to North Korea, leaving Li Peng in charge. Allies in the leadership urged him to cancel the trip, but he was concerned at the message of crisis that would send. Before leaving, he believed he had won support from the leadership for his plan to address the student movement through serious dialogue between the government and the student leadership. But in the week he was gone, the balance of power would move decisively to the hardliners, and on his return he would never regain the upper hand. Guo Jian did not see the students kneeling that day. Instead, he was herded with his campus classmates to watch the official broadcast on television. The university administration was determined to stop their students from joining the demonstrations and had even locked the gates to the grounds. But when Guo Jian heard the students from Peking and Tsinghua universities marching past 3 days later, he just scaled the wall and jumped. At first, he walked along beside the marchers, not yet ready to join their ranks. The students had announced a mass boycott of university classes, a strike that would last until their petition was answered. There were lots of police on the streets, but he noticed that even they seemed to be supporting the students. Once at Tiananmen Square, he roamed around, observing, yet still hanging back. But when he returned to campus, he saw a notice calling for Minzu University students to march to the square, and he immediately went to his class studio to paint a poster. After a bit of thought, he decided on a simple slogan: "Long live teachers." Surely, he thought, that wouldn't get him into much trouble. Although he tried to convince his classmates to prepare their own posters, as they set off, he found a group of them trailing empty-handed in his wake, placing him in the unwanted role of leader. They marched through the streets lined by ordinary Beijingers who urged them on, gave them the thumbs up, even handed them drinks. Arriving at the square, Guo Jian tried to convince his classmates to return to campus instead of joining the sit-in on the square. He had a feeling that the police would be sent in to clear them that night. Despite his fear, he decided to stay out himself, and he watched the dawn come over the square without violence. But in the morning came grim news. It had been broadcast overnight, and now it was emblazoned across the front page of People's Daily. The mouthpiece of the Communist Party had delivered its official damning verdict. The student movement, the paper's editorial declared, was aimed at creating turmoil in the country and must be resolutely opposed. The use of the word turmoil, donglan, was chilling. The period of the Cultural Revolution was routinely referred to as the 10 years of turmoil, and the editorial had deliberately drawn a line between the students' actions and the worst events in Chinese modern history. To see the People's Daily headline shriek, "We must resolutely oppose turmoil," was profoundly shocking and frightening. But if linking their idealistic movement to the horrors of the Cultural Revolution was bad, the rest of the editorial was worse. The paper denounced the student movement as a planned conspiracy by a small group of people to negate the leadership of the party and the socialist system itself, and to put at risk the whole project of reform and opening up. The students' demonstrations, independent unions, and boycotts were all specifically condemned. The message had to have come from the top of the party, direct from the mouth of Deng Xiaoping. At the stroke of a pen, the students found themselves labeled as counter-revolutionaries. "We were very scared when we saw the editorial," Guo Jian told me, "and we felt cornered. It made people want to stay in Tiananmen Square." Everyone was talking about an expression in Chinese, 秋后算账, which literally means, "we'll settle up after the autumn harvest," but carries a menacing subtext of squandering accounts when the time is ripe. "We believed if we left the square and went back to our campuses," Guo Jian said, "they might not come for us straight away, but in the end, they would come." From April 26 on, the editorial became the primary consideration in the students' strategy. While it stood, they could not simply return to campus. They had to press forward. In China, Guo Jian told me, people know the best way to stay safe is to make something bigger to be safe in a crowd, to find protection by being surrounded by other people. The students decided to ramp up the pressure. The next day, students streamed out of colleges and universities all over Beijing, heading for Tiananmen Square. But this time, they weren't alone. They were joined by their teachers, by journalists, and by the ordinary workers and citizens of Beijing, all angered by the editorial and chanting, "Patriotism is not a crime." By the time they reached the city center, their numbers had swelled to 100,000. They marched under the hot sun, alternately singing and chanting, while people on the pavements applauded or pressed cold drinks and popsicles into their hands. The students carried collection boxes and found them stuffed with cash. When they reached the police blockade, they simply pushed through it to the square, and the police, though standing 4 deep, let them go. As they flowed into the square, they felt that April 27th marked a great victory. Their teachers were with them, and it seemed the people of Beijing were too. But now what? Zhao Ziyang arrived back in Beijing on April 30th. By this time around, 90,000 students were boycotting their classes. No meaningful dialogue had been held, and the anniversary of the May 4th movement was looming. The deep divisions in the leadership were now clear for all to see. Li Peng and his fellow hardliners had taken advantage of Zhao Ziyang's absence to convince Deng Xiaoping that the students' movement was dangerous. At a special briefing at Deng's home, they played up the most inflammatory words and actions of the students and convinced him that the movement concealed plots seeking to stir up turmoil, to bring down the party and the whole socialist system. Having urged him to such a conclusion, they rushed to get it into print. From the moment he arrived back in Beijing, Zhao Ziyang looked for a way to overturn the editorial. He knew that the only person who could sanction this was Deng Xiaoping. But Deng, he was told, was too ill to receive him. At the time, Zhao Ziyang commanded a bare majority in the top leadership group of the party. On the 5-man Politburo Standing Committee, he commanded 3 votes, and his rival, Premier Li Peng, had 2. But Li Peng had powerful support among the old guard in the party, those elders who had officially retired from public life, but still exercised influence. Most crucially, he now seemed to have won the support of Deng Xiaoping, on whom Zhao had previously been able to rely. At a meeting of the Politburo Standing Committee on May 1st, Zhao argued for more transparency and consultation in political life, for a guarantee of freedom of speech, and for a country that was truly governed by law. Li Peng countered that stability must be assured before there could be any talk about reforming the political system. Privately, Zhao Ziyang tried to persuade Li Peng that the People's Daily editorial must be revised, but he refused to budge. In the face of this, Zhao decided that he would play down the editorial by setting a new tone himself. On May 3rd, he gave a speech commemorating the anniversary of the May 4th movement. In it, he specifically endorsed the patriotism of the students, the validity of their calls for greater political participation, and their opposition to corruption. He doubled down the next day with a nationally televised speech along the same lines at a meeting of the Asian Development Bank, in which he specifically supported dialogue with the students. On May 4th, the students held another rally in Tiananmen Square. Again, they marched there in their tens of thousands, flowing through police lines like water. Again, the people of Beijing turned out to support them with food and drink. The charismatic 21-year-old student leader, Wu Erkaishi, was carried toward the square on the shoulders of his classmates, waving a red flag, his flamboyance and exuberance capturing the triumphant mood of the day. The students declared themselves the heirs of the great patriotic May 4th movement, reiterated their key demands, and then announced their intention to return to classes and await the promised dialogue. But even as Zhao Ziyang worked to calm the students' situation, he was being undermined. Since before his North Korea trip, he had been directing that there be dialogue with the students, but those tasked with the job by Li Peng were doing everything they could to block and ultimately destroy the process. The students waited for more than a week for the dialogue to begin. Finally, out of frustration and fear, with no sign of dialogue in sight, they decided on a dramatic new course. On May 13th, they announced a hunger strike. The students now listed only two demands: that the People's Daily editorial be repealed, and that the government hold televised talks with the students. They knew Mikhail Gorbachev was due to arrive in Beijing in just 2 days' time. Surely under this pressure the government would act. The hunger strike was a fatal decision. When the students commandeered Tiananmen Square for this protest and refused to move aside even for the arrival of Gorbachev, they doomed both their movement and the reformists led by Zhao Ziyang. Within days, martial law would be declared, Zhao Ziyang toppled, and the clock would begin its countdown to the bloody climax of June 4th. And yet, the hunger strike would inspire the most extraordinary and beautiful days in the history of Beijing as the city rose in solidarity. Teachers, parents, shop and factory workers, farmers, government officials, journalists, taxi drivers, even police marched in support of the students under banners which proudly proclaimed their occupations and workplaces. Even journalists from People's Daily marched under a banner that read, "We did not write the editorial." On May 17th and May 18th, days 5 and 6 of the hunger strike, more than 1 million people marched in the capital. Tens of thousands of supporters from around the country flocked into Beijing, and for a few short days, censorship was lifted and the Chinese media reported freely on the events. These were the largest spontaneous demonstrations in Chinese history. They were not the organized massed rallies of the Cultural Revolution, which had filled Tiananmen Square with ranks of hysterical teenagers. These were the hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of individuals choosing to stand up in support of a movement that they had taken to their hearts. For a brief moment, it seemed that China was on the verge of an extraordinary change. Tiananmen Square turned into a mass encampment. Up to 3,000 hunger strikers lay in makeshift tents or in the public buses that the students had commandeered, while tens of thousands of supporters thronged around them in the heat, breaking occasionally into song, or dancing to music that blared out from portable tape recorders. The music was punctuated by the wailing of sirens as ambulances ferried collapsed hunger strikers to hospital, the sight of medical workers in crisp white uniforms, red crosses pinned to their sleeves, carrying pale and painfully young students on stretchers to ambulances, was heartbreaking and inspiring. The strikers wore white headbands on which they had written slogans in stark black ink. Guo Jian, who had joined the hunger strike, chose an inspiring phrase he had read somewhere. He gathered, he told me years later, it was a quote from some foreign writer. "If I don't have freedom, I'd rather die." I think that's what it said, he told me. "Give me liberty or give me death," I suggested. "Yes, that was it," he said. As he lay in one of the buses, friends came by to sign his sweat-stained headband. My oldest Chinese friends, the young artist and his feisty girlfriend, who had entertained me in their tiny Hutong home just over 3 years before, were now living apart. He had chosen exile in Australia at the beginning of the year, hoping to make his way as an artist there. She had remained in Beijing, holding true to her dream of a bohemian life in the capital. The student movement took her by storm. "It was so exciting to feel really part of something for the first time," she told me later. "To believe you could make a difference, that you could change things, that you were making something happen, something for the country." Every day she met her friends in the square to discuss ideas. It was like an open-air university crossed with Woodstock. She sent a letter to her boyfriend in Australia, predicting that the students would prevail. "We will celebrate a great victory," she wrote. She was shocked to find Guo Jian among the hunger strikers. He had seemed like such a quiet boy when she had first met him. It was amazing to see him transform into an activist. But then, that's what it was like in those days. People kept transcending themselves, like the ordinary Beijingers who came by every day to check on the students and to lend support. A rumor went around in those weeks that even the pickpockets were on strike in solidarity. Shenqi also came to the square day after day. When Hu Yaoban died, he and some friends were just about to open an exhibition, but on hearing the news they abandoned it immediately to go to Tiananmen. All through April and into the hot days of May he wandered there, excited, shocked, trying to make sense of it all. The students from Peking University and the others, their thinking was so advanced, so deep. I thought of what we art students had been concerned with, fighting propaganda art and so on. Such small things. I was so impressed by them. But as the weeks passed, he also felt the pressure mounting as the city ground to a standstill. The buses had stopped running, and cars could no longer drive on the streets, and you could sense the danger building. His parents kept writing, calling, beseeching him to come home. From far off Anhui, maybe it was easier to see the danger. In the square, the students didn't yet feel afraid. They felt like heroes. They believed the country was on their side. Having the world's media focusing on them, too, was seductive. Yet, the ground had already shifted under their feet. Up until Gorbachev's visit, they had the protection of the reformers in the government, in particular Zhao Ziyang. But in holding the square, they had humiliated Deng Xiaoping and fatally undermined the moderate position being urged by Zhao Ziyang. Gorbachev's visit was to have been Deng's crowning achievement in foreign affairs, with China's one-time big brother coming to Beijing to pay court. The students had robbed Deng of the official ceremonies that would have been so gratifying. Gorbachev inspecting a military honor guard in Tiananmen Square. Gorbachev with bare head bowed placing a wreath at the monument to the people's heroes. Instead, the square belonged to the students, and all the world's cameras were trained on them. The day after he met with Gorbachev, Deng gathered the Politburo Standing Committee at his home. Zhao Ziyang again urged him to revise the People's Daily editorial to calm the situation. But instead, Deng announced his decision to impose martial law. Zhao refused his support, sealing his downfall. His rival, Premier Li Peng, was put in charge of implementing the decision. Martial law was not declared until 2 days later, and in those 2 days there occurred two extraordinary contrasting spectacles. The first took place on May 18th, when Li Peng finally met with the student representatives at the Great Hall of the People in a nationally televised encounter. It was 4 weeks since the student petitioners had knelt on the steps of the building, begging him to receive them. 4 weeks in which the student movement had engulfed the city and brought it to a standstill. But when he finally met them, Li Peng still showed no sign of actually listening. Instead, he talked down to the students as if they were children, telling them that they must bring their hunger strike to an end immediately and leave the square. He made no attempt to disguise his irritation when students pressed their conditions, expressing impatience with such quibbling. The student leader, Wu Erkaishi, who had collapsed at the hunger strike earlier that day, came to the meeting in his hospital-issued striped pajamas and carrying an oxygen canister. But he showed no sign of being cowed by the occasion. He spoke directly and vehemently to Li Peng. The students on the square would make their own decision based on the government's response, and their conditions were clear. The People's Daily editorial must be repealed and genuine dialogue established. The sight of this young man in pajamas going head-to-head with the dour, Mao-suited Premier of China was electrifying. The confrontation between the government and the students had been playing out for weeks on the streets, but now he saw it vividly, made flesh. The students were rejecting the paternalism on which the Chinese Communist Party rule was based and demanding their right to be heard. But as much as I wanted to maintain my optimism, watching the broadcast, I found it hard to fight a sense of foreboding. We had been mesmerized by what we had seen on the street, the swelling popular support, the passion of youth, the joy on the faces of the Chinese journalists finally getting a chance to do their jobs, and in doing so, we had lost the sight of the power imbalance between the students and the government. The power was not on the street with the students, but with this middle-aged man in a Mao suit shifting irritably in his anti-massacre-draped armchair as the students pressed their case. And we didn't even know that he held two trump cards. Martial law was looming, and his rival, Zhao Ziyang, was finished. The second spectacle could not have been more different. In the early hours of May 19th, the day after the student leaders met with Li Peng, a clearly emotional Zhao Ziyang came to the square to talk directly to the students himself. Speaking into a megaphone that students passed up to him, he implored them to end their hunger strike, which was now entering its 7th day. He told them he understood them, that in his youth his generation had also taken great risks for the revolution, and in so saying, made it clear that he respected their patriotism. He told them if they stopped, dialogue would definitely not be closed, and many things could be resolved. They were young with their lives ahead of them, he said, and he asked them to think of what the consequences would be if they continued. It was the nearest to a warning he could give. When he finished, the students mobbed him for his autograph, passing up scraps of paper to sign, even pushing forward their pajama sleeves for him to write on. But they did not heed his warning. It was the last time that Zhao would be seen in public. After June 4th, he would be formally removed from all his posts and would spend the rest of his life under house arrest. In those last days before martial law was declared, a very different kind of celebrity also came to Tiananmen Square. Cui Jian. Nothing to My Name was the student's unofficial anthem, but on that day, he chose to perform another song, which would in the years that followed become just as deeply associated with Tiananmen Square. It was called A Piece of Red Cloth. In this song, Cui Jian tells of how someone blindfolded him with a piece of red cloth and then asked him what he could see. Happiness, he replied. They asked him how it made him feel. Comfortable. It made him forget that he had no place to call home. They asked him where he wanted to go, and he told them he wanted to follow them. They asked him what he was thinking. He said, I want to let you be my master. Before he sang the song, he called out to the students, Listen up. The person asking the questions in this song is not a girl. It's the government. It was the government that had blindfolded them, he was telling them. It was the government that had wanted them to find happiness in seeing the world their way. In those spring days, the students had thrown off the blindfold. They could applaud Cui Jian's words and sing along, but before long, most would be wearing the blindfold again. On the morning of May 20th, martial law was declared. Army units had begun to advance on Beijing from all directions the previous night, but ordinary Beijingers once more rallied to protect the students. Makeshift roadblocks were thrown up at key intersections leading into the center of the city, and tens of thousands of people surrounded the convoys, stalling the troops in the suburbs. A group of independent traders set up a motorcycle squad they called the Flying Tigers, which zipped around the city bringing news of troop movements back to the students in the square. The student leaders called off the hunger strike, but clashed over what to do next. Wu Kaishi, for all his fieriness, pushed a moderate line, urging the students to withdraw for their own safety, but also to undermine the rationale for martial law and give the reformers a chance to regroup. But the more radical voices in the movement argued that to give up the square was to give up their power. One passionate student leader, Chai Ling, who had risen to prominence during the hunger strike, argued that the square was the students' only stronghold, and to give it up meant certain defeat. It was her argument that prevailed. In the days leading up to the final crackdown, Chai Ling would become one of the most recognizable voices in the movement, rallying the students to defend the square, resisting arguments to withdraw. In the days after martial law was declared, many Beijing University students did return to their campuses, but this left the square dominated by students from outside the capital. More than 50,000 of them had arrived in Beijing in the days before martial law. Those recently arrived craved their time in the sun. Just as martial law was declared, a new element had been introduced to the protests, one that was particularly threatening to the government. A group of workers had announced the establishment of an independent workers' union at Tiananmen Square. This raised the specter of the Solidarity Trade Union in Poland, which had fought a grueling 10-year battle with the Polish communist regime and had just run an agreement from the government for parliamentary elections, scheduled ironically enough for June 4th. The balance in China slid even further away from moderation. As army units remained stalled in the suburbs of the capital, some soldiers actually partied and sang revolutionary songs with the local residents. Around the city, Beijingers extended small acts of kindness to the soldiers, bringing them food and drink, and they showed little urgency to move on to take control of the center of the city. On May 23rd, in an extraordinary act of defiance of the martial law order that banned all demonstrations, once again, 1 million people rallied in Beijing, waving placards that read, "Long live democracy," and "Freedom for the press." In the square, vendors sold Beijing street snacks and soft drinks, and a party atmosphere descended across the city, seemingly making a mockery of martial law. But the square was becoming more squalid in the heat, and the sense of stalemate had sapped the students' resolve. Moderates among the student leadership again urged a move back to their campuses to regroup. On May 27th, this moderate position was carried by a vote of the key student leaders, but almost immediately afterward, the more radical among them changed their mind and declared they would stay after all. The students on the square, the majority of whom were new to the protest, supported the radicals enthusiastically. It was one more missed chance. There were people who were really trying to achieve something, Guo Jian told me later, and others who were just trying to make things worse. I was trying to make people believe we had already achieved things and we didn't need to sacrifice ourselves there. But if you said that, people thought you were scared or you were a traitor. Meanwhile, Deng Xiaoping had rallied the support of army commanders around the country, directing each to send seasoned troops to Beijing to augment the greener ones that were in a holding pattern in the suburbs. Soon, there would be some 200,000 troops surrounding the capital, rivaling the number that had been mobilized during the war against Vietnam 10 years before. As May drew to a close, despite the resolve of the radicals among the students, it seemed that their occupation of Tiananmen Square was petering out of its own accord. Many Beijing-based students had returned to campus, while some of the outsiders were beginning to leave too. But in these last days before the crackdown, 2 further events again would bring Tiananmen Square to life. My friend sat in a corner of the studio watching intently. The student leaders on the square had asked the Central Academy of Fine Arts to create something special to inspire their fading movement. Now, after 3 days' work by dozens of students, the project was taking shape. She had watched as the young artists formed the giant pieces of sculpture out of wood and polystyrene, and then swathed them in white plaster. The sculpture's face was visible now, along with its flowing hair, upstretched hands, and the torch they held. She was a goddess of democracy. Her features seemed vast. She had been designed to stand more than 10 meters tall enough to stand eye to eye with Mao Zedong's portrait above Tiananmen Gate. They brought her to Tiananmen on the back of 3 pedal carts late on the evening of May 29th, to the whoops of excitement from the square. Overnight, they built a scaffold and then raised each piece into place. Before noon the next day, the young artists made their last touches, smoothing the goddess's hair and her flowing robes with fresh plaster. Meanwhile, news had spread throughout the city of this strange apparition at Tiananmen, and by noon, the square once again hummed with people. The art students had delivered on their promise and had fanned the movement into flame again. They had also delivered an extraordinary provocation. There was no mistaking that their goddess was the sister of the Statue of Liberty. The students had brought a symbol of foreign power into the very heart of China's capital and set her face in flaming torch towards Mao. This theatrical, reckless act was yet another gift to the hardliners. In the previous few days, Li Peng had commissioned reports from the Beijing government and the security service on the true nature of turmoil and Western infiltration aimed at demonstrating that the student movement was a front for a foreign plot to overthrow the party. Now the students had provided the perfect cover image for those reports. Huang Rui had been watching the demonstrations unfold for weeks on his television in Japan. He understood only too well why the students would want to occupy Tiananmen Square. He knew the excitement of rallying at the heart of Beijing, but he also knew how badly it could end. As June approached, he could see the students were in trouble. Finally, he couldn't just watch anymore. He gathered together as much money as he could in donations and flew to Beijing. On June 2nd, Li Peng met with Deng Xiaoping to brief him, the other party elders in the Politburo Standing Committee. Based on the reports he had commissioned, Li Peng painted a frightening picture of a student movement infiltrated by CIA agents and intelligence operatives from Taiwan, of turmoil whipped up by an alliance of Western and domestic reactionary forces bent on the destruction of the party and socialism. Foreign students, journalists, and diplomats were all part of the plot, as was the United States broadcaster, The Voice of America. Even the Fulbright program was implicated, accused of using academic exchange as a means of spiritual infiltration aimed at drawing the country into the United States bourgeois web. These foreign forces were in league with black hands within China who hid behind university posts, think tanks, and private companies to promote their reactionary ideas and manipulate the students. In Li Peng's briefing, the new independent student and worker associations were all engaged in underground activities to overthrow the government. He spoke of their secret oaths and attempts to instigate mutiny among the martial law troops. Tiananmen Square had been occupied to provide a frontline command center for the turmoil, a base for counter-revolutionary propaganda and for assaults on the party and the government, a place from which they would direct their final showdown. To achieve their purpose, the student occupiers had gathered around them terrorist groups like the Flying Tiger Motorcycle Brigade and trampled on the sacred and solemn space of Tiananmen. There was no mention of the students' long-standing calls for dialogue and the reversal of the editorial. Their real aim, Li said, was the overthrow of the government. In fact, he said, the students had even drawn up a list of officials marked for execution. His briefing did not explain how a small group of students had managed to manipulate millions of their fellow Chinese to support them. It did not acknowledge that the students who remained on the square might simply have painted themselves into a corner, that, under the threat of the People's Daily editorial, they were too frightened to abandon Tiananmen. Deng Xiaoping's mind was made up. Stability must take precedence over everything, he said, so Tiananmen Square must be cleared. There were no dissenting voices. The moderates on the Politburo Standing Committee, who had earlier argued against martial law, Zhao Ziyang and Hu Qili, had already been removed from power. Qiao Shi, who had abstained during the martial law debate, now fell into line. Later that day, the order was given for troops to begin their advance on the city center. Overnight on June 2nd, an attempt was made to infiltrate large numbers of troops into the city wearing plain clothes, while their arms were brought into the city in unmarked vehicles. Although a number of soldiers and arms reached their rallying points around Tiananmen Square in this way, a traffic accident late that night in the west of the city exposed this maneuver, and by the early hours of June 3rd, students and ordinary Beijingers had converged again on the main intersections leading into the city to set up roadblocks. Army vehicles were overturned, tires were punctured, soldiers scattered. Buses carrying groups of soldiers and weapons were surrounded and stopped. A group of demonstrators discovered a bus filled with armaments just near Zhongnanhai, and police and soldiers tear-gassed the crowd to regain control of the vehicle. All through the day on June 3rd, tension mounted as large crowds gathered in the streets near the square, bringing traffic to a standstill. In the square itself, a last, somewhat theatrical attempt to engage the government was playing out. On June 2nd, a group calling themselves the Four Gentlemen announced a new hunger strike on the square. The gentlemen included Taiwanese-born pop star Hou Dejian and an iconoclastic critic called Liu Xiaobo. These two men were both stars in different ways. Hou Dejian was handsome, famous, and fresh from Hong Kong, where he had played a benefit concert for the student movement alongside the beloved diva Deng Lijun. Liu Xiaobo was popular in student circles for his passionate critiques of Chinese culture and for his vehement belief in the need for intellectuals to get involved rather than commentate from the sidelines. In years to come, he would become China's most famous prisoner of conscience. Liu Xiaobo had been in New York when the demonstrations had begun, but he could not resist coming home to participate. Over the weeks, he had helped the students out in various ways and tried to give them counsel, particularly on the need for them to legitimize their leadership through democratic elections. But he now felt it was time to put himself more firmly on the line. He and his fellow gentlemen called for martial law to be lifted, dialogue to be renewed, and for an embrace of democratic principles on all sides. The square soon filled again with people eager to witness this new spectacle. But it was all too late. There was no one left in power who had any interest in compromise. In Zhongnanhai, the fierce resistance to the entry of the troops to the city on the night of June 2nd, and this new hunger strike only served to harden the leadership's resolve. Late in the afternoon on June 3rd, the leadership agreed to use any means necessary to put down what was now described as a counter-revolutionary riot in the capital. Deng Xiaoping made just two stipulations. The the square must be cleared by dawn on June 4th, and that there was to be no blood shed on the square itself. On June 3rd, Huang Rui wandered uneasily near the square. He was booked to fly out the next day. When he had first arrived in Beijing in late May, he found the situation chaotic, but he had not felt the foreboding he felt now. He had had this bad feeling in his gut before, in April 1976, before the morning demonstrations for Zhou Enlai had been broken up by the militia. Tiananmen Square was a symbolic space. In 1976 and again now, there was a fight between the government and the people to control it. History told him who would win. Out in the university quarter, Anwar had been noticing her for days, a girl crying by the gates as the students left for the square. She was the last person he'd expected to see cry. She used to come to his parties and dance all through the night. Now she stood day after day crying by the side of the road. "Why are you crying?" he asked. "Because they won't be coming back," she said. He thought it was ridiculous. What reason was there to think that? Later, he would remember her and realize how much this sad young Cassandra had understood. On the night of June 3rd, Guo Jian was in the square when the word came. People came running in, shouting, "They're shooting! They're shooting!" But in the square, it was still quiet. He decided to head west to see for himself. He pedaled fast down the Avenue of Eternal Peace, with a classmate by his side toward the western suburbs and the major intersection of Mushidi. Surely they were firing rubber bullets, he thought. The army wouldn't shoot Chinese citizens. Since early that night, an announcement warning people to stay off the streets had been broadcast on a continuous loop on radio, television, on PA systems throughout the city, and on university campuses. But instead of staying in their houses, tens of thousands of Beijingers were converging on the major intersections leading into the center to main roadblocks. For 2 weeks they had kept the troops out of the city. That night, they planned to do the same. But on the night of June 3rd, they would face a very different army to the one they had encountered 2 weeks before. Regiments had been bolstered by seasoned troops from around the country. Tens of thousands of infantry, backed up with artillery and tank units, were under strict orders to reach Tiananmen Square by 1 a.m. on June 4th and have it cleared by dawn. The soldiers carried assault rifles loaded with battlefield ammunition. The 38th Group Army entered the city from the west, along the grand east-west axis that becomes Chang'an Avenue, the Avenue of Eternal Peace. It might have been expected that the 38th would have some sympathy with the citizens and students of Beijing. Based near the capital in the neighboring province of Hebei, they had connections within the city, and some Beijing students had even done their military reserve training with them the previous summer. In fact, in the weeks before the final crackdown, the commanding officer of the 38th, Major General Xu Qingxian, had challenged the order to impose martial law. When his corps rolled into Beijing on June 3rd, he was under arrest. Under new command, the 38th proved the most zealous that night in carrying out their orders. Perhaps his predecessor's insubordination made the new commander all the keener to prove his loyalty, or maybe it was because the resistance to the troops was greater in the west of the city. But whatever the reason, the 38th Group Army's entry to the capital proved the bloodiest of that bloody night. When they met the first roadblock on the east-west axis at Gongzhufen, they initially used tear gas and rubber bullets to push back the crowd. Then as the crowd reformed and finally stood in a wall thousands strong, the infantry dropped into battlefield formation and opened fire directly into the crowd. From then on, they followed the same ruthless pattern, ineffectual attempts at riot control followed by deadly force. Later, the government would claim that the army had insufficient riot gear to control the crowds that night, making the use of live fire unavoidable. But the deciding factor on the night was not resources, but the order that they must reach the square by 1 a.m. They were on a deadline, and nothing was allowed to stand in their way. The bloodiest engagement anywhere in the city that night was at Mushidi, just 2 kilometers further along the road to the square from Gongzhufen. Mushidi is now, as it was then, a comfortable residential area, dotted with high-rise apartments housing senior government officials. Those apartments overlook the bridge where Beijing citizens and students once more tried to stop the soldiers' advance. The crowds had pushed buses across the road and armed themselves with bricks and broken-up concrete with which they battled the anti-riot brigade who arrived first on the bridge. Beaten back, the brigade was replaced by soldiers who rushed across the bridge in waves, firing into the crowd. Each time they fired, The people scattered only to regroup. Slowly, the soldiers pushed the people back across the bridge, firing repeatedly into the crowd, who still tried to fight them with whatever fell to hand. Soon, at least 100 people lay bleeding out on the street. The residents of the apartment blocks cursed the soldiers from their windows, yelling, "Murderers! Fascists! Bandits!" and raining objects down on their heads. And so the soldiers began to strafe the apartments too. At least 3 people died at home that night, one of them while fetching a glass of water by an open window. Once the infantry had cleared the bridge, armored personnel carriers, trucks, and tanks drove across behind them, heading east toward the square. In their wake, some citizens erected fresh roadblocks and set them ablaze, while others rushed the dead and dying to the nearby Fuxing Hospital. On the road where the army vehicles had passed lay the tangled blood and flesh of some who were beyond salvation. The 38th rolled eastward, stalked by a crowd who followed at some meters' distance. The soldiers fired into the crowd whenever they felt challenged, whether by Molotov cocktails, rocks, or with shouts, as they moved inexorably toward the square. As Guojian rode nearer to Mushidi with his classmate, he could hear the sound of gunfire, but it still sounded to him like fireworks. He couldn't believe they'd be using live ammunition. But as they got nearer, he began to see the dead and wounded by the side of the road, and he knew, this is real now. They rode up beside the Fuxing Hospital, and from there, Guojian could see smoke from the burning roadblock at Mushidi. Armored trucks and tanks were rolling toward them out of the haze. He watched in horror as soldiers fired directly into the crowd. They weren't firing wildly. They were taking aim, firing, maneuvering, then firing again. It was exactly like when he was in the army. These men were firing as they had been trained to do in battle. Guojian and his classmate ran down into the entrance of the hospital and found the foyer awash with blood. The wounded from Mushidi and beyond were brought to the hospital in a constant stream, on the backs of pedal carts, on bicycles, on anything that could serve as a stretcher. Beside the entrance where the bicycles were normally parked, bodies lay in a pile. Guojian longed to do something heroic, but he felt paralyzed. He sat down on a chair inside the door. His classmate slumped beside him. And then a doctor came out and said, "We need help. Come with me." And he took us into a room where we almost slipped in the blood. There was so much blood. I couldn't look at it, and so I just looked at the doctor. He told me he needed someone to take out the dead bodies to create space for the wounded coming in. But I just couldn't do it. I walked out. It was too much for me. I thought, I don't want to be a man. And I sat down again feeling so guilty. Then I heard someone say they needed people to carry in the wounded from the street, and I thought, I can do that. The wounded were lying where they'd been shot. The army was still passing by. Guojian and the other volunteers waved white cloths as they went to lift the first person from the road. We carried the first guy back to the hospital. His blood was running out like water. He was alive then, but I don't know if he survived. Then we went out again to collect the next person. But this time the soldiers started shooting. We scattered, but one of us was shot, and after that, we knew there was nothing more we could do. Nothing they could do, they thought, but ride west to their campus and warn their classmates not to come to the square. On the way, they passed Mushidi. In an apartment block overlooking the bridge, they saw an old lady standing on her balcony screaming down at the soldiers who were still rolling into the city below her. She was yelling, "Fascists! Fascists!" and the soldiers fired straight at her. Then she was quiet. Later, her neighbors carried her body down into the street. They rode on until they reached their university, where they could tell them what they had seen. My friend made her way up towards Chang'an Avenue from her home in the Hutongs, south of the square. It was past midnight. Earlier that night, she had been in the square and afterwards had walked aimlessly through the streets nearby with a young student friend. They had been seized with a kind of restless energy for days. What was the government going to do? They knew something must happen, but what? It was such a warm night, and after hours of walking, she had finally conceded to her friend that her new fashionable shoes didn't fit her after all. She would have to go home and change them. He'd be fine on his own, he said. They agreed to meet back at the intersection of Chang'an Avenue and Xidan, west of Tiananmen Square. But now as she neared Chang'an Avenue, She heard a sound like fireworks, but she knew it wasn't fireworks. The broad avenue was lined with people, thousands standing by the road watching the army roll eastward towards the square. In the distance, there was a glow of fire from burning roadblocks. She searched for a friend, but couldn't see him. The street was bathed in a strange light, the glowing fires mixing